Some souls growl because breaking apart is quieter than crying. The retired police dog had not allowed a human hand near him in 742 days. 3 trainers quit. 2 shelters transferred him away. By the time Ghost arrived at Ironwood Animal Rescue outside Billings, Montana, the staff stopped calling him difficult and started calling him hopeless. The German Shepherd lived in the last kennel at the end of a narrow concrete corridor where the lights flickered and the air smelled faintly of bleach, wet fur, and old rain carried in from the mountains. A red warning sign hung on the gate. Do not enter without supervision. Even then, nobody stayed long near him. Every morning before sunrise, Ghost paced the kennel in slow circles, nails clicking sharply against the concrete floor. His sable coat had once been beautiful, but now patches of gray crept around his muzzle like winter frost settling over old earth. A faded police canine collar still hung loosely around his neck because nobody had managed to remove it safely. Sometimes he would stop pacing and stare at the wall in complete silence, as if listening for footsteps that never came back. The volunteers whispered about him when they thought nobody could hear. Said the dog had snapped after losing his handler. Said something inside him never returned from that night. But grief has strange ways of protecting itself. Around 6:15 on a freezing Thursday morning, snow drifted softly against the shelter windows while the old radiator hissed weakly in the hallway. Emily Parker, the morning supervisor, balanced a tray of food bowls in trembling hands as she approached Ghost's kennel. "Easy, boy," she whispered carefully. Ghost stood motionless in the shadows. His amber eyes reflected the dim overhead light like distant fire. Emily slid the food bowl through the lower hatch and slowly backed away. Only then did the dog move. Not aggressive, not loud, just cautious, like a soldier scanning for danger that might still be hiding nearby. A sudden sound echoed from the front office. Tap, 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 slow and uneven against the concrete floor. Ghost froze instantly. The hallway went silent except for the old humming lights overhead. Tap, tap, tap. A cane. Emily looked up as a tall man stepped carefully through the shelter entrance, snow dusting the shoulders of his dark green military coat. He moved with hesitation, one gloved hand guiding the white cane ahead of him while the other brushed against the wall to steady himself. The man's eyes were pale and unfocused beneath the brim of a black wool cap. Blind. The receptionist hurried toward him. "Sir, can I help you?" The stranger offered a tired smile. "I was told you have a retired police dog here." His voice carried the calm heaviness of someone who had survived things he never fully spoke about. Name's Elias Ward. At the far end of the hallway, Ghost slowly stepped closer to the kennel gate. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the dog was no longer growling. The sound of the cane continued down the hallway with slow measured taps that echoed softly against the concrete walls. Elias Ward moved carefully through the shelter like a man navigating a world built for other people. Snow melted from his boots onto the floor in small dark patches, while cold mountain air drifted in behind him every time the front door opened. Up close, he looked older than 39. Not weak, just worn down in the quiet way winter wears down fence posts left too many years in the storm. A faint scar crossed the left side of his jaw beneath several days of rough stubble, and his pale blue eyes stared forward without focus beneath the shadow of his cap. Emily walked beside him carefully. "Most people do not come asking for Ghost," she admitted softly. Elias gave a small tired smile. "Most people are smarter than me." She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat when Ghost suddenly stepped closer to the kennel gate. The German Shepherd's ears lifted high. His breathing slowed. No growling. No pacing. Just stillness. Elias stopped walking. "That him?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded before realizing he could not see her. "Yeah," she whispered. "That is Ghost." For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. Snow tapped lightly against the shelter windows while somewhere in the back room an old dryer rumbled with damp blankets, turning slowly inside. Elias tilted his head slightly, as if listening beyond sound itself. "Funny," he murmured. "He does not sound angry." Emily stared at him in disbelief. Every person who met Ghost said the same thing first. Dangerous. Unstable. Broken. But Elias had heard something else hidden beneath the silence. The veteran stepped closer until the tip of his cane lightly touched the kennel gate. The metal made a soft ringing sound. Ghost flinched at the noise, but did not retreat. I used to work with dogs overseas, Elias said quietly. Not officially. They just always found me somehow. Emily folded her arms against the cold. Ghost was a police K-9 in Denver. His handler passed away almost 2 years ago during a nighttime call. Her voice lowered. After that, he stopped trusting anybody. Elias nodded slowly like someone who understood more than he wanted to. Yeah, he whispered. Loss changes the shape of a soul. Ghost stepped closer again until his nose nearly touched the bars. Elias could hear the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing now. Warm, careful, alive. He slowly removed his glove and knelt onto one knee despite the ache in his joints. Emily immediately tensed. Sir, maybe do not. But Elias had already extended his hand through the lower gap in the gate. The entire hallway seemed to stop breathing. Ghost stared at the hand for several seconds that felt much longer. Emily could hear her own heartbeat. The old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while snow continued falling silently outside the windows. Then Ghost lowered his head. Slowly, carefully. The German shepherd pressed his scarred muzzle into Elias's open palm with the gentleness of something exhausted from fighting the world for too long. Elias inhaled sharply. His fingers trembled against the dog's fur. Thick, cold around the edges from the winter air drifting beneath the kennel door. The veteran swallowed hard as emotion tightened his throat unexpectedly. Hey there, soldier, he whispered. Ghost closed his eyes. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. She had worked at Ironwood for 11 years and had never once seen the dog allow contact without fear or resistance. Yet here he stood completely still beside a blind stranger whose voice carried the same quiet loneliness hidden inside the animal himself. Elias slowly smiled through wet eyes. Nobody ever really retires from guarding hearts, do they? And for the first time since arriving at the shelter, Ghost gently leaned closer instead of pulling away. By noon, the storm outside had softened into a slow gray snowfall that covered the parking lot in fresh powder and silence. Most of the shelter staff stayed unusually quiet that day, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thing had just happened in the last kennel. Emily stood near the office window with a paper cup of cold coffee in her hands while watching Elias sit cross-legged on the concrete floor outside Ghost's enclosure. He had not moved much in nearly an hour. Neither had the dog. Ghost remained close to the gate with his massive head resting near Elias's knee, his amber eyes following every small movement of the blind veteran's hands. No tension, no warning growls, just calm. I still do not understand it, one volunteer whispered nearby. He used to slam himself against the bars if somebody stood there too long. Emily shook her head slowly. Maybe the dog recognizes something in him. Across the hallway, Elias smiled faintly while running his fingers gently through the thick fur along Ghost's neck. You know, he said softly, people think blindness is the hardest part. Ghost's ears twitched toward his voice. It is not. Elias tilted his head slightly, as if listening to snow brushing against the roof overhead. The hardest part is when everybody starts talking to you like you disappeared too. The words settled heavily in the quiet shelter. Emily looked away for a moment, suddenly understanding why the hallway no longer felt cold. Elias continued absent-mindedly scratching behind Ghost's ear while the dog leaned into the touch with the slow, careful trust of something relearning safety inch by inch. After Afghanistan, Elias murmured, people stopped knowing what to do with me. He laughed once under his breath, though there was no humor in it. Friends visited for a while, then less, then not at all. Ghost gave a low rumble in his chest. Not anger, something softer. Elias nodded gently. Yeah, you get it. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine through tiny cracks around the old shelter windows. Somewhere deeper in the building, another dog barked twice before falling silent again. But Ghost never looked away from Elias. The German shepherd stayed close enough that the warmth of his body cut through the chill rising from the concrete floor. Emily carefully approached the kennel with a folded blanket in her arms. You are welcome to sit in the visitation room if you want, she offered quietly. Elias smiled faintly. I think he likes it here. As if answering him, Ghost slowly shifted closer until his shoulder pressed lightly against the gate near Elias's arm. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Emily felt tears sting her eyes anyway. She had spent months watching this dog refuse every attempt at comfort. Yet now he sat beside a blind stranger like an old partner returning from a long war neither of them ever truly left behind. Elias lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "What happened to your handler, boy?" The moment the question left his mouth, Ghost's breathing changed. The dog lifted his head slightly toward the far corner of the kennel, where shadows stretched long across the floor beneath the flickering light. Elias could not see the sudden tension ripple through the German shepherd's posture, but Emily did. Ghost stared into the darkness silently, ears alert, body perfectly still. Then for the first time all day, the old police dog let out a sound that barely resembled a growl. It sounded more like grief. Grief leaves echoes long after the noise is gone. The shelter grew quieter as evening settled over the Montana hills and darkness pressed softly against the frosted windows. Most of the volunteers had gone home by 6 o'clock, leaving only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rattle of wind against the building. Snow continued falling outside in slow drifting sheets that covered the empty parking lot and buried the tire tracks from earlier that morning. Inside the kennel hallway, Elias remained seated near Ghost with his back resting carefully against the cold concrete wall. Emily had brought him a cup of hot coffee nearly an hour earlier, but it sat untouched beside him now, steam long faded into the chilled air. Ghost had not left the gate once. The German shepherd stage stretched along the floor directly across from Elias. His massive paws crossed neatly beneath him, while his amber eyes watched the blind veteran with unwavering attention. "You still awake over there?" Elias asked quietly. Ghost answered with a soft huff through his nose. Elias smiled faintly at the sound. "Yeah, me too." The old shelter heater kicked on with a loud metallic groan somewhere above them. Warm air drifted weakly through the vents, carrying the scent of dust and worn blankets. Elias tilted his head slightly toward the sound, listening the way people do when they no longer trust their eyes to explain the world. "I used to hate silence after I lost my sight," he admitted softly. "Thought the quiet would swallow me whole." Ghost slowly lifted his head. Elias rested both hands around the paper coffee cup even though it had already gone cold. "At night, I kept hearing things that were not there anymore. Helicopters, radio chatter, boots and gravel." He swallowed once. "My squad." The hallway remained still except for the slow rhythm of Ghost's breathing. "Doctors told me the mind holds on to pain because it is afraid to lose the people attached to it." Elias laughed faintly under his breath. "Funny thing is, nobody warns you what happens when the pain is all you have left." Ghost rose carefully onto all fours. The sound of his claws tapping softly against concrete echoed down the hallway as he moved closer to the kennel gate. Elias sensed the movement immediately. His hand lowered instinctively toward the floor near the bars. Ghost pressed his nose gently against the veteran's wrist. Warm, steady, present. Elias closed his eyes, even though darkness already lived there permanently. "You miss him too, do not you?" he whispered. For several seconds, Ghost remained perfectly still. Then slowly, the German shepherd turned his head toward the back corner of the kennel again, where shadows pooled beneath the dim overhead light. His ears lowered slightly. A quiet sound escaped his chest. Not fear. Memory. Emily stood unnoticed near the office doorway, listening silently. Earlier that afternoon, she had searched through Ghost's old police records after seeing the way he responded to Elias. The handler's name had been Officer Nathan Cole. 8 years in K-9 together. Commendations for search and rescue work. Missing children found during winter storms. Elderly hikers brought home alive. One faded report mentioned how Ghost refused to leave Nathan's side after the accident that ended his career. Emily looked down at the paperwork, still trembling slightly in her hands. "Oh my God," she whispered to herself. Inside the kennel hallway, Elias slowly reached toward the old collar hanging around Ghost's neck. His fingers brushed against worn leather before touching something metallic hidden beneath the fur. A badge tag, cold from the winter air. Ghost did not pull away. Elias carefully held the tag between trembling fingers while his expression shifted almost instantly. "Nate," he whispered suddenly. Emily froze where she stood. Elias swallowed hard. "Your handler was named Nate?" Ghost stepped closer so fast the kennel gate rattled softly beneath his weight. His tail gave one slow, uncertain movement behind him. Elias inhaled sharply as realization settled over him like snowfall. "Nathan Cole," he whispered again, voice breaking slightly now. He was there the day I lost my sight. The entire hallway seemed to stop breathing. Sometimes the people we lose leave pieces of themselves behind so they can still find their way home. Snow drifted steadily through the night sky outside Ironwood Animal Rescue, while the old shelter lights cast pale reflections across the icy parking lot. Inside the kennel hallway, nobody moved for several long seconds after Elias spoke Nathan Cole's name aloud. Even the heater seemed to fall silent. Ghost stood pressed against the gate, breathing harder now, his amber eyes locked onto the blind veteran as though something buried deep inside him had suddenly awakened. Elias slowly tightened his fingers around the cold metal badge hanging from the worn collar. His throat worked painfully before he spoke again. Nate was Denver police before he transferred into military K-9 support overseas for a joint operation. Emily stared at him in disbelief. You knew him personally? Elias nodded once. For 8 weeks. His voice had gone quieter now. He reached unconsciously toward the faded marine ring on his finger, like touching memory itself. Long enough to trust him with my life. Ghost gave another low rumble deep in his chest. This time the sound carried urgency instead of grief. Elias slowly smiled through damp eyes. Yeah, he whispered toward the dog. I remember him too. Outside, wind brushed softly against the shelter walls, carrying the scent of pine and distant snowfall through tiny cracks near the roof. Emily carefully stepped closer while holding Ghost's old file against her chest. Nobody ever came for him after Nate passed, she said softly. The department tried retraining him with another handler, but he stopped responding to commands. Then he started shutting everyone out. Ghost lowered himself slowly onto the kennel floor without breaking eye contact with Elias. The movement felt less like obedience and more like exhaustion, finally finding someplace safe enough to rest. Elias reached through the bars again, gently scratching behind the dog's ear. Nate used to do that exact thing, he murmured. Right behind the left ear when Ghost got nervous before missions. Emily felt chills move through her arms. How did you know that? Elias smiled faintly. Because this stubborn dog nearly knocked me over trying to sit in my lap during a thunderstorm outside Kandahar. For the first time all evening, Emily laughed softly through tears she could no longer hide. Ghost's tail moved once against the concrete floor. Slow, careful, almost uncertain how happiness worked anymore. Elias tilted his face slightly upward as if trying to picture a sky he had not seen in years. Nate talked about him constantly, he said. Said Ghost was smarter than most officers he worked with. His expression darkened gently beneath the dim shelter lights. The last time I heard Nate's voice was over radio chatter during a sandstorm. After that, he stopped speaking. Ghost slowly stood again and pressed his forehead firmly against the bars near Elias's hand. The veteran exhaled shakily. I never got to say goodbye to him either. Emily looked between them in stunned silence. 2 survivors connected by the same absent man. One had lost his sight. The other had lost the only voice he trusted. And somehow in the middle of a freezing Montana winter, they had found each other inside a forgotten shelter hallway that smelled like bleach, wet fur, and old sorrow. A loud crack of thunder rolled suddenly across the mountains outside. The building trembled softly beneath the storm. Instantly Ghost reacted. His body stiffened. Ears alert. Eyes fixed sharply toward the front entrance. Elias sensed the change at once. Ghost. The German shepherd let out a deep warning growl unlike anything Emily had heard earlier that day. Not fear this time. Protection. Footsteps echoed faintly from somewhere near the shelter lobby. Slow. Heavy. Unfamiliar. Ghost stepped directly against the kennel gate between Elias and the hallway as another sound followed through the silence. The front door opening. Dogs do not always bark at danger. Sometimes they remember it first. The front door groaned open against the storm outside, sending a burst of icy air rolling through the shelter lobby. Snowflakes swirled briefly beneath the overhead lights before melting across the worn tile floor. Ghost immediately stepped closer to the kennel gate, his posture rigid now, ears raised sharply toward the sound of approaching footsteps. The deep warning growl in his chest vibrated through the hallway low and steady like distant thunder. Elias slowly rose to his feet using the bars for balance. Who came in? He asked quietly. Emily leaned toward the hallway entrance, heart suddenly pounding harder than it should have. A tall man in a dark brown coat appeared near the reception desk carrying snow across his boots. Mid-50s maybe. Broad shoulders, gray stubble, the kind of face weathered by years outdoors. He removed his gloves slowly while glancing around the nearly empty shelter. Evening, he said politely. Roads are getting bad out there. Ghost's growl deepened instantly. Emily frowned. Can I help you, sir? The man stepped farther inside, brushing melted snow from his sleeve. Name is Walter Grady. I heard this shelter had an old police dog available for transfer. Ghost slammed once against the kennel gate hard enough to rattle the metal walls. Emily jumped. Walter stopped moving immediately. Easy there, he muttered under his breath. But Ghost was no longer simply nervous. His entire body had gone tight beneath his thick sable coat. The German shepherd stared toward Walter with an intensity that felt almost human. Elias turned his head slightly toward the sound of Ghost's breathing. What is he doing? Emily swallowed. He does not like this guy. Walter forced a small laugh, though tension flickered across his face. Animals usually love me. Ghost barked once. Loud, sharp, furious. The sound echoed violently through the hallway. Elias flinched slightly, but instead of stepping away, he slowly lowered one hand toward the dog through the bars. Ghost, he said calmly. Easy, soldier. The reaction was immediate. Ghost stopped barking but remained planted firmly between Elias and the hallway. Protective. Watching. Walter's expression shifted almost too quickly to notice. Not fear exactly. Recognition. His eyes narrowed slightly toward the dog's collar. That canine from Denver? He asked carefully. Emily blinked. How did you know where he worked? Walter hesitated only half a second. Read about him once online. But Ghost's growl returned even lower this time. Elias stood completely still now, listening carefully. Blindness had sharpened the way he heard tension in voices. The veteran tilted his head slightly. You ever work law enforcement? Walter looked toward him. No. Elias nodded slowly, though something in his expression tightened. Funny, he murmured. You wear boots like somebody trained to stand ready. Silence settled heavily across the hallway. Snow tapped softly against the shelter windows while the old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Walter shifted his weight once. Ghost immediately mirrored the movement from inside the kennel. Every muscle alert. Emily stepped closer to Elias instinctively. Sir, she said carefully, we are actually closed for transfers tonight because of the storm. Walter forced another smile, thinner this time. Right. Of course. But he did not leave. Instead, his eyes drifted once more toward Ghost with something unreadable hidden behind them. The German shepherd suddenly released a sound unlike any Emily had heard before. Not anger. Not fear. A warning born from memory itself. Elias slowly reached toward the cold metal tag hanging from Ghost's collar again. Then quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, He remembers you. Memory lives in places the world cannot see. The shelter hallway felt colder after Elias whispered those 4 words aloud. He remembers you. Walter Grady stood motionless beneath the flickering fluorescent lights while snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his coat onto the tile floor below. For a brief second, something shifted in the man's expression. Not confusion. Not surprise. Guilt. Ghost's growl deepened immediately, as if the dog could smell the emotion itself. Elias remained still beside the kennel gate, one hand resting gently against Ghost's neck while listening carefully to the silence hanging between everyone in the room. Blindness had taught him something sighted people often missed. The truth usually changed the air before it changed a face. Walter cleared his throat roughly. I think you are mistaken. Ghost barked once again. Sharp. Furious. The kennel bars rattled beneath the force of his body. Emily stepped backward instinctively. Ghost has never reacted like this before, she whispered nervously. Walter forced a dry laugh that sounded thinner each time he used it. Dogs get unpredictable when they get old. Elias slowly shook his head. No, he said quietly. Old dogs do not look at strangers like they are remembering a fire. The hallway fell silent again except for the storm winds brushing softly against the shelter roof overhead. Ghost stared at Walter without blinking. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body remained tight beneath his sable coat. Elias lowered his voice almost to a whisper. Tell me something, he said carefully. How did you know Ghost worked Denver K9 before anybody here mentioned it? Walter hesitated. Tiny, barely noticeable. But Ghost reacted instantly. The dog released another warning growl, so deep it almost sounded human. Walter shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of the animal's stare. I told you, he muttered. I saw something online years ago. Elias tilted his head slightly. Then why did your heartbeat change when he barked? Emily stared at Elias in shock. Walter's face hardened. You saying I am lying? Elias shrugged faintly. I am saying this dog trusted one man after losing Nate. And right now he is standing between me and you like he already knows how this story ends. Thunder rolled low across the mountains outside, shaking loose snow from the shelter roof. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Ghost suddenly backed away from the kennel gate and turned toward the dark rear corner of the enclosure again. His breathing became uneven, restless. Elias frowned slightly. What is he doing? Emily stepped closer to look. He keeps staring at that corner. Walter's expression shifted instantly at her words. Tiny, fast, but enough. Ghost lunged toward the back wall of the kennel and began pawing hard against the concrete floor beneath an old blanket shoved into the corner. Emily jumped. Ghost, stop. But the dog ignored her completely. He kept scratching frantically at the floor while releasing sharp, desperate whines between growls. Elias straightened slowly beside the gate. There is something there. Walter immediately took one step backward toward the lobby entrance. Ghost barked furiously the moment he moved. Emily looked between the dog and the man, now visibly sweating despite the freezing air. Sir, she said carefully, why are you leaving? Walter forced another strained smile. Storm is getting worse. I should head out. But before he could turn away, Ghost slammed one final time against the kennel gate with such force that the old latch snapped loose. The metal door creaked open. Emily gasped softly. Walter froze. Ghost stepped into the hallway slowly now. Silent. Controlled. His amber eyes locked directly onto Walter Grady while snow hissed quietly against the shelter windows behind them. Elias stood perfectly still in the center of it all, listening as Ghost walked past him for the first time without hesitation and stopped directly in front of the man, trembling near the door. Then the old police dog lowered his nose toward Walter's coat pocket and began to growl. Truth has a scent fear cannot hide. Walter Grady stood frozen near the shelter entrance while Ghost remained directly in front of him, shoulders tense beneath his thick sable coat, amber eyes burning with recognition older than words. The low growl rolling from the German shepherd's chest filled the hallway like distant thunder trapped beneath concrete. Snow continued whispering against the windows outside, while the fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting pale shadows across the floor. Elias slowly stepped forward with one hand extended toward the sound of Ghost's breathing. Easy, boy, he whispered carefully. But Ghost did not move away from Walter. He lowered his nose closer toward the man's coat pocket and growled harder. Walter's breathing had become uneven now. Emily could hear it clearly. Sir, she said cautiously, what is in your pocket? Walter forced a smile that looked painful around the edges. Nothing. Ghost barked sharply. The sound exploded through the hallway. Walter flinched hard enough for something metallic to slip loose inside his coat. Elias heard it immediately. A faint clink. Small. Hollow. Familiar. His expression tightened. Dog tags, he whispered. Walter's face drained of color. Emily stared at him. Why do you have military tags? Walter swallowed hard and slowly reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. Ghost's growl deepened instantly, but Elias lowered his hand gently toward the dog again. Stay with me, Ghost. The German shepherd obeyed without taking his eyes off Walter for a single second. Finally, Walter pulled out an old silver chain tangled tightly around itself. Dog tags, worn smooth with age. Emily covered her mouth softly. Elias stood perfectly still. Read the name, he said quietly. Emily stepped closer and lifted the tags carefully into the light. Her breath caught instantly. Nathan Cole. The hallway went silent except for the storm outside. Walter looked away first. I was supposed to deliver them to his family, he muttered weakly. Elias slowly shook his head. No, his voice had gone colder now. Those tags disappeared after the operation overseas. Ghost stepped one pace closer toward Walter. Not threatening. Certain. Like the dog had spent years waiting for this exact moment to finally arrive. Walter rubbed both shaking hands across his face. You do not understand, he whispered. Nate blamed himself for what happened to your convoy. Elias frowned slightly. What are you talking about? Walter stared down at the tags. I worked private security during the deployment. Logistics support. His voice sounded smaller, now beneath the growl of winter winds outside. There was confusion during the sandstorm. Routes got mixed up. Elias felt his chest tighten. Memories long buried beneath darkness and grief stirred painfully awake. Radio static. Screaming wind. Nate shouting warnings through comms. Ghost barking somewhere nearby. Walter swallowed hard. Nathan tried to reroute your unit before the explosion happened. Elias stood frozen. Ghost slowly lowered his head beside him, pressing against the veteran's leg like silent support. Walter's voice cracked. Afterward, Nate carried those tags every day because he blamed himself for what happened to you. Snow drifted harder against the windows now, covering the world outside in white silence. Emily looked down at the trembling tags in her hand. Then why keep them all these years? Walter closed his eyes briefly. Because Nate asked me to find Ghost if anything ever happened to him. Ghost's ears lifted instantly at his handler's name. Walter looked toward the old police dog with tears beginning to form. I tried, he whispered. But after the funeral, he disappeared during transfer. Nobody knew where he went. Elias slowly knelt beside Ghost and rested one trembling hand against the dog's thick neck. The German shepherd immediately leaned into him. Warm, steady, alive. Walter stared at them both beneath the flickering shelter lights. I came tonight because I saw the rescue listing online 2 days ago. His voice broke softly. I just wanted to bring Nate home to him. Ghost stopped growling. Some bonds do not end when a heartbeat stops. They simply wait in silence until love finds its way back. The storm finally began to fade sometime after midnight, leaving the mountains outside Ironwood Animal Rescue buried beneath fresh, untouched snow that shimmered pale beneath the parking lot lights. Inside the shelter hallway, the world felt quieter now, softer somehow. Ghost lay beside Elias with his massive head resting across the veteran's boot, while the old police tags sat carefully in Elias's hands. He traced the engraved letters slowly with trembling fingers as if touching the past itself. Nathan Cole. For several long minutes, nobody spoke. Walter remained seated near the front wall with both hands folded tightly together, exhaustion weighing heavily across his face. Emily quietly brought over an old blanket and draped it around Elias's shoulders before stepping back into the silence. The heater hummed softly overhead. Snow melted from Ghost's fur onto the concrete floor in small silver drops. Elias swallowed hard before finally speaking. Nate used to say Ghost hated thunderstorms because he thought every loud noise meant somebody needed saving. Ghost lifted his ears slightly at the sound of his handler's name. Elias smiled faintly through wet eyes. Guess he never stopped trying. Walter stared quietly at the floor. Nathan talked about you too, he admitted softly. Said you were the kind of Marine who checked on everybody else before checking your own wounds. Elias let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like pain leaving the body after years trapped inside it. He saved my life that day. His fingers tightened gently around the tags. I just never got the chance to thank him. Ghost slowly pushed himself upward, then stepped carefully closer until his forehead rested against Elias's chest. The blind veteran wrapped both arms around the German shepherd instinctively, burying one hand deep into the thick fur around his neck. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, Ghost fully relaxed. No tension, no fear. The old police dog exhaled one long, trembling breath and closed his eyes. Emily quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. I think he was waiting for you, she whispered. Elias shook his head softly. No, his voice cracked gently beneath the dim lights. I think we were both waiting for Nate. Outside, the storm clouds slowly parted over the Montana mountains, allowing pale moonlight to spill across the frozen world in soft silver waves. The shelter hallway no longer felt lonely. It felt sacred somehow, like grief itself had finally loosened its grip long enough for healing to sit down beside it. Walter slowly stood and walked closer before kneeling beside Ghost. The dog opened his eyes but did not growl this time. Walter carefully reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old faded photograph curled at the edges from years of being carried. Nathan Cole stood smiling beside Ghost in the picture, one hand resting proudly against the young dog's shoulder beneath a bright Colorado sunrise. Walter handed the photograph to Elias. The veteran could not see it, but his fingers traced the worn paper carefully while Ghost leaned closer against him. He is smiling, isn't he? Elias asked quietly. Walter nodded through tears. Yeah. Silence settled warmly around them. Ghost's tail moved once against the floor. Slow, peaceful, like a soldier finally hearing the war was over. And somewhere deep within the stillness of that snowy Montana night, three wounded souls understood the same quiet truth at once. Love does not leave when people do. Sometimes it stays behind in the hearts that remember.